How many of your high net worth clients really care about ESG?
Well, we set a target last year to have at least 50% of the private bank's AUM invested in ESG investment classes, and that was by 2023. In less than 8 months, we had achieved that target, so we are very pleasantly surprised. I think there's overwhelming interest and passion in ESG investments.
But Woon Shiu, is it because you are offering the product or they are actually interested? How does it work?
Yeah, so I think it's both ways. So
Yeah.
families today are getting more interested in ESG narratives, and they're moving away from just looking at just pure stakeholder financial returns. They're looking at impact returns as well, also because of the reason that the next gen's voices are getting louder. Today is no longer about what first gen wants to do. The next gen do feel strongly about these issues, and their voices are also the reason why these topics are being surfaced to the forefront of the conversation with us.
Yes, of course, since COVID-19, we just underwent a pandemic that we've never seen before for most of us. Has changed perceptions or changed attitudes towards ESG?
Certainly so, because of what these families, even the ultra-high families, have gone through themselves during COVID. So you might think for a second that ESG is something which I think is something which is from the West, but our families in the East, having gone through some of these turmoil themselves during COVID, they really feel the importance of driving especially the S part and the G part of the conversation. Let me give an example. So we have families that we serve in Indonesia. They were seeing communities around them really just fall like flies during COVID, and they said, we can't just sit back and not be involved in this. So let's drive the conversation for S a bit more. And I can do that in two-pronged, through my businesses, through my investments. And that's how the topic of ESG has risen to the forefront, because there are more and more avenues for them to really demonstrate and amplify their interest in this area.
Yeah. And so there was a question, Woon Shiu, a while ago, which we weren't able to post, right? Around discussions around ESG, whether ESG is like CSR, right? Is it CSR? So when you're discussing on topics like ESG with wealthy clients, is there confusion among them with the concept of philanthropy, which is kind of been around? It's in Asia, philanthropy is quite famous. The rich families do it. What we call perhaps check writing, in essence. Is there confusion between philanthropy and ESG?
Yeah, I won't say it's confusion. I would say it's a convergence of some of these objectives that both these channels are serving, because they're driving impact. So in the earlier days that we are talking about philanthropy, people will just be writing checks, as you mentioned, but today they're driving these narratives into venture philanthropy, and some of these will overlap with impact investment. So I would say it's not a confusion, but it's an overlapping, and clarity is what they're seeking now, and clarity is what banks, institutions like us, advisors, are helping them channel their energy in the right areas where they can do well in both scenarios, both investments in ESG space and philanthropy from venture space.
So there's a bit of crossover at the moment.
Certainly there will be.
Education is a big part of that.
Yes.
Jobs, Woon Shiu, that you're doing, speaking to your clients.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned about next gen, which is, we hear that a lot, how next gen perhaps is changing the mindsets around ESG. But when you look around the region, the clients you have around the region, are there differences amongst your clients in terms of their approaches, their thinking, and is it different countries have different approaches and so on? Maybe share with us a little bit more granular view around the region.
So there will be a major difference in terms of views depending on the stage of evolution of the growth of the family and social capital of the families which we serve. So as an example, families that are from Southeast Asia, from Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, some of these are into the third generation. Families that we serve from China, for instance, are still very much in the first generation. So you can imagine that in terms of the receptiveness of some of these ideas, we're at two different levels. Because for families that have been really sitting on wealth and growing their wealth in a very sustainable way for the last 3 generations, for them to say, I'm going to be involved in ESG, I'm going to be involved in impact, it's an easier conversation, because the first second generations have made the job easier, they have laid the foundations. So for third gen who are passionate about world causes, economic climate reasons, and all these changes that's impacting the world, I think it's easier for them to say, I want to do this right away. For first gen, let's say from China, they're very much in the phase of still creating wealth, growing their wealth, so their focus at this stage will of course be different. Some of these first gen are also getting involved into ESG conversations, but their lenses in which they assess some of these investments is very much different from the lenses of the second gen or third gen in Southeast Asian countries. I do see a more willing appetite in families in Southeast Asia to deploy catalytic or patient capital compared to the first gen in China, for instance.
Yeah, that's a very important kind of distinction, quite interesting as well, where the generational change happening in Southeast Asia versus, let's say, China. But the other issue is, of course, we were pretty excited this morning listening to all the initiatives, all the efforts by corporates, investors, what they're trying to do, and so on and so forth. But of course, as an advocate for ESG in wealth management, Woon Shiu, when you wake up in the morning or when you talk to your colleagues, what are some of the challenges that you face as you try to push this ESG agenda?
Yeah, so we are at the nascent phase of driving these narratives in Asia, I believe. And I think it's an upward hill for us to really make sure that there's more widespread acceptance of some of these ideas. But I think we are in very lucky times. We are in very, very fortunate jurisdictions, Singapore, because the government is our huge tailwind. They are driving all these conversations together with us. And you hear of MAS coming up with optionalities like ESGpedia, you have ESG Impact Hub. So all these are adding wind to what we're trying to drive here. I think that's actually giving us, a lot of us in the wealth management space, a lot of impetus, a lot of actually drive to try to say, let's do this together because we have the government behind our back. So when you position Singapore as a hub to clients for wealth management and you're able to connect the two, not just wealth management, private banking, but you're bringing conversations on how to really do impact, how do you issue green bonds in the industry you're involved in, how do you drive this connection and this overlapping, and how do you make this a seamless flow of growing capital and recycling capital. That's what makes me excited in the morning when I get up, because it's no longer about me just telling the client, oh, you should look at this particular fund, this structure note is interesting. It's not about that. And of course, in terms of what we drive in terms of products, when you see that the structure note we offered in 2018 that's linked to ESG, compared to the same structure note we launched this year, subscribed by 7 times more, you know that you're making a difference in your client's mindset. You know that in maybe 5 years' time, the client that you serve will be really deeply involved in ESG. That gives me great assurance and great comfort.
Now, you touch on Singapore. Singapore is now at the epicenter of a lot of the wealth management over the last few years. I touched on the data shared with us by MAS. It's actually an estimate from Minister Tarman on the fact that there are now 700 family offices at the end of last year from, what was it, 400 previously. And now we are drilling down a little bit. When you talk about family offices, how many of these offices are engaged in ESG conversation, or is it really early days? Because many of them are just literally just setting up.
So in the family office landscape as well, Singapore is at the nascent stage. So I would say out of the 700, I would say maybe 40% or so are really geared up to do ESG investments. The remaining 60%, they're finding their way. Some of these people are just getting in the door because they want the tax exemption benefits. Some are trying to amplify their residency status through these schemes. So for someone to really deep dive into ESG narratives and impact investments, it takes time. And I do personally feel that at this stage, 60% of these FOs are not ready for the conversation yet, but they are definitely interested in pursuing these. I see them taking extra steps. Active energy is being used to try to drive engagements in this space with partners such as the private banks that serve them, with the government agencies, because believe it or not, ESG is being championed every day at agencies like the MAS and the EDB. And when they speak with family office principals, CEOs, they mention ESG, they mention venture philanthropy all the time. So we have many different stakeholders all jumping in this conversation with these family office principals, and that's driving the energy, that's driving the momentum we're seeing in this space in the wealth management arena.